Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm doing a review for Fire and Blood, which by George R. R. Martin, which is a history book in the world of A Song of Ice and Fire / Game of Thrones. And today I'm going to discuss this spoiler-free. If you want more spoilery thoughts, I have already done a spoiler discussion on Jake's channel, which I will link in the description down below and also at the end of the video. And I'll also put this video and also that one into my A Song of Ice and Fire / Game of Thrones playlist. So yeah, check that one out after you're done watching this one. There we go into more depth about certain topics that are in this book. Here I just want to quickly cover how I felt about the book in a spoiler-free manner, what it covers and how it reads, and also if I would recommend it, one, to Song of Ice and Fire fans, but also to a more general audience. So let's quickly talk about what this book is about, because this isn't a straight-up novel like you would normally expect. This is written like an in-universe history book, as if it was written by a maester in the world of A Song of Ice and Fire. And it covers the first half, roughly, of the Targaryen dynasty's reign in Westeros. So we start off with Aegon's conquest, and then we cover roughly 140 years. So as you can tell already, 140 years, that's quite a long time for, especially compared to the main books in the series. So obviously, this won't read like a normal narrative novel. It's written as if a maester has written a history book in the universe. So basically, we get the maester, he talks about his sources and what we know about the history, what we know about the events, and then we also, in some topics, we get multiple versions of the story because some sources differ and we don't have a clear answer. So it's a very interesting read in that aspect, that while the writing style can feel dry because it's very distant, we're not in our protagonists or main characters' heads, we're in a very distant format from them, but because there is this question of which source is correct and how the sources are biased, it creates a very interesting narrative for me personally. Now, I will tell you straight up, like, if you aren't already a Song of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones fan, I don't know if you would enjoy this. I don't think this is the best place to start. There will certainly be people who will like this quite a bit, but this isn't really something I would recommend unless you're already invested into the world and are interested in the Targaryen history, because it's kind of, it's hard to suggest it to people who aren't already invested, because you don't really have a reference point. This doesn't hold your hand and introduce a lot of the world building aspects. It kind of assumes you're familiar with the world, you're familiar with all these different families. It introduces a lot of different characters that, maybe you won't be used to, and even if you've read the main series, there are a lot of like families and stuff that get introduced that aren't really something you have seen before. So it's a very not a standard novel. So just know that before you go into it, because I think if you go into it expecting a normal story, you're going to get disappointed and be like, okay, what is happening? There's almost no dialogue, no inner thoughts of these characters. So yeah, but if you've accepted that this is written like a history book, I think it's very interesting to explore how all these events are really covered, and how it's interesting to think about all the sources and how they may be biased, and how the different sources, which one of them is correct. So yeah, in that aspect, I think while it probably isn't written in a way that would be suitable for everyone, I think if you're into this world already, it will be very interesting. And there is a lot of theorizing going on about what versions of the stories in this book are correct, and if any of them are actually accurate, or what exactly the truth is. So yeah, that I really enjoy. Now, for some more thoughts about certain aspects, I want to quickly talk about the characters. As I mentioned, we don't get a lot of inner thoughts, or basically any inner thoughts, because we're not in these characters' heads. We only get reflections of a person that's living almost 300 to 100, like 150 to 300 years later, who's accounting like what these people were like. So it's like, you get somewhat of a view of what these characters are like, but it's not really in the same way you would in something like A Song of Ice and Fire, where you're super detailed in somebody's head and you get all of their thoughts. Um, so in that way, the characters, like the way your investment is into the characters, is quite different. I still got invested in a lot of the main cast here because I think that Martin is just very good at getting you invested into a character and just coming up with interesting character premises. But this isn't a case where you will be like, if we take examples from the main series, it won't be like you're in Jon Snow's or Daenerys Targaryen's head and you're just feeling all of their decisions with them and feeling all of their struggles. This is, in a lot of cases, it's like, okay, this is what this person did, and if they did something that was really good or like feels like a good thing to do, you'll get a more positive view on them. But if you see somebody who's doing something terrible, you only get the fact, okay, this is what they did, or this is what that source says they did, but you don't really get the inner struggle that would go on in that person before they make that decision most of the time. So that's why the perspective you get on these characters is quite, I would say, polarizing. Like, it's not very nuanced in that sense. What we get is a historic view of these characters, and what we get is obviously a lot of a biased perspective, because history, I think this book actually does a pretty good job of showing that history can be biased. Like, it's pretty easy to see that a lot of these sources, they have their own agendas, and also a lot of the history maybe written by the party who won, so the party who didn't win gets portrayed in a worse light. So yeah, that's pretty interesting. I felt like I was surprised how invested I got into some of these characters. I think the core cast, like all of the kings and the core cast around them, are yeah, they're realized quite well. But I would say where this book struggles a bit, and this depends on the section, on the section of the book that we're talking about, but I think the side cast can be a bit tough, because in a lot of these cases a lot of side characters get introduced, because if you have a war, if you have battles, we get all of these different side characters, but we don't really know them, so it's hard to get invested into them. But in some cases, the side characters are very well developed. And I will talk a little bit more about each section later on, which will kind of explain where I think this was an issue. But I think some of these sections, it's hard to get invested in all of the characters, because a lot of time he will just go and be like, okay, this army had people from this house, this house, this house, this house, this house, and these were the leaders, and then they were just following this person. So it's kind of like it's a list of people and a lot of people, and at the end it's like, okay, I know these names maybe, but like they aren't really that well fleshed out. And the book clearly focuses more on the Targaryens and the people in their immediate surroundings, so that's why those characters feel way more fleshed out than the side cast. um, yeah, which again can be a pitfall of the book, but I think given the format that this book is in, that's kind of to be expected. Like, you can't expect in a 700-page history book to flesh out all of these characters, because you have 140 years worth of characters, right? So you can't just flesh out each and every one of them. But I can see why somebody would be like, okay, this is too many characters and I don't care about any of them. Why are you telling me all of this information? So again, that brings me back to the point of, if you're not already invested, it might be a bit of a hard read. Personally, I really enjoyed it, but I'm also a big A Song of Ice and Fire fan. Then the next thing is we are covering obviously the Targaryen history, and since it's the first half of the Targaryen history, we get a lot of dragons, which is cool, and it's really nice to see the Targaryen family at the height of their power, because in the main series, obviously, we pick up where they're out of power. So it's really cool to see them in power. I've already read the stories about Dunk and Egg, which take place 100 years before the main series. And there also the Targaryens are in power, but there the dragons have died out. So at that point already, you can see the Targaryens in power, but you don't see them at the height of their power, where they have all these dragons and they're, yeah, being treated like a very special family, like the last dragon lords in this world. So it's very interesting, the way it's handled, and it's a nice change of pace to see it. Yeah, and then I quickly want to talk about the fact that this book has a lot of illustrations. They're all black and white. But if you go through this book, like every 10, 15 pages, there are nice black and white illustrations. So here we have the three conquerors, Aegon and his sisters. Then, yeah, we have some very cool dragon artwork here as well. I don't know if I can find one right now. So you can see some nice artwork with dragons, and yeah, so if you're into artwork, I think this is a good book to read. Obviously, it's black and white, so it's not as vivid as the artworks in here in the World of Ice and Fire, but I think it's still a very good read if you like illustrations. And actually, the illustrations help to kind of break up a bit of the dryish part, so you can also just look at the pictures to kind of recover a bit from a lot of the dense information you're being fed in this book. All right, so that's my general thoughts. Now I want to quickly go into the different sections this book covers. So as I said, this covers basically 140 years. And we start with Aegon's conquest, and we end up with the ascension of Aegon III. And I would personally say this is roughly like 5 sections. We have basically Aegon's conquest and his reign. Then we have the sons of the dragon, the sons of Aegon I. Then we have the whole section I would just call the conciliator, the reign of Jaehaerys and Alysanne. Then we have the Dance of the Dragons, which Jaehaerys and the Dance of the Dragons, those 2 sections are really the heart of the story in this book. And then we have like After the Dance. Those are the 5 sections, I would say, and I would say like the Jaehaerys section is 1/3 of the book, the Dance of the Dragons part is another third, and the other 3 sections are like basically another third. So yeah, I quickly want to go through each of these and talk about what I liked, what I didn't like. So let's start with the Aegon's conquest. I liked the part about Aegon's conquest. It wasn't my favorite. I think it's a really cool history of. It's a really cool period of time, and it's a really cool event to read about. But I had already seen a lot of like the lore material for Game of Thrones, and I've also read a lot of stuff online about the lore and particularly this history, this part of history. So I was already familiar with most of what was covered here, especially the conquest part, all the battles and all the ways that the Targaryens conquered and the whole Norn stuff. So that's why it wasn't a lot of new information. So it was kind of not boring to read, but it was like, okay, I already know this stuff, so it's not the most interesting. But then when we move into Aegon's reign, I think it gets quite interesting because we see, okay, how did he rule, and yeah, how did his reign affect the people, basically? So I think that was an interesting aspect to read. It wasn't my favorite section, but I think it's still worth reading. Then we have the Sons of the Dragon part, basically the 2 sons of Aegon, which are Aenys the First and Maegor the First, and their reigns. That section was also quite interesting. I think it's pretty cool to see how quickly the power dynamics change as soon as Aegon dies. And I think there's a lot of crazy stuff going on in this time period, and it sets up quite some interesting stuff. Yeah, again, not my favorite section. This is interesting to read, but I would say it's basically the trajectory is going up a bit. Then we have the section about the conciliator. We have the long reign of Jaehaerys I and his wife Alysanne. So this is my favorite part of this. And I was super impressed by it because this long reign, this is basically 55 years of peace and prosperity, more or less. Like, obviously there are issues always, but this was basically 200 or 300 page section of this book, which was just about a peaceful time mostly. So it would be, you would expect that it would be the most boring part because there isn't a lot happening. But actually, I felt like that part was actually the one that this kind of narrative was most suited to, because that's where you really got into the characters. That's where we had enough time to really get to know Jaehaerys, get to know Elisand, get to know their children, get to know the people that were around them. And I think the general story was written really well. And actually, in my edition of the book, there is an interview with George Martin at the very end where he talks about the book. And it turns out the Jaehaerys part is actually the one that he wrote at the end, because if you don't know, the way he wrote this book, this book came out in 2018. He actually wrote a lot of this material before that. A lot of the material was written for certain novellas he did before that. It was written for the World of Ice and Fire here. And when actually he was compiling the stuff for the World of Ice and Fire, he wrote way too much, basically. So they couldn't put everything inside there. So he had a lot of stuff written. But he said for the Jaehaerys part of this, he had just written basically 55 years of peace and prosperity. So the Jaehaerys part was the major part of this book that wasn't written when they decided to publish this. So for a lot of the other sections, he could just reuse material that he had already written before. But the Jaehaerys part he actually had to write from scratch for this book. And I think you can pretty much tell that it's written by a better writer. Like I know that's a bit weird to say, but it feels like the Jaehaerys part just has more heart, and it feels like there is more care put into the characters in that one. And like I felt that way before I knew that he wrote that part later. So I was like I was super impressed by the Jaehaerys part. And then when I read that interview later on, I was like, okay, maybe it makes sense. Maybe it's just that he got better as a writer, or he was way more into writing that part. So I thought that was interesting. Yeah, the Jaehaerys part, it's super interesting. There are a lot of characters that are there. It's not the most plot-heavy time, let's say. It's not the most conflict-heavy time. There are a lot of personal conflicts. There isn't a lot of wars and battles going on. But I think Jaehaerys' part is the best written in this, and it's clearly, like, Jaehaerys and Elisand are probably my two favorite characters in this book. I think they're realized very well, and yeah, as I said, it's kind of weird that 55 years of peace is basically what's the standard of this book, but it is. There are some things in that section that I just love. Yeah, so that's that part, and then after Jaehaerys, we move into the Dance of the Dragons, and there is a bit of a transition between those, but I would say basically I'm considering the Jaehaerys part until his reign is over, and I'm considering everything after that, the Dance of the Dragons, basically. Obviously, it's a history, so stuff that happens before influences stuff that happens later. So it's not actually sectioned that way, the way I'm talking about it, but that's kind of what I'm considering. And the Dance of the Dragons is, I think, basically the main part of this book. Like that's a big conflict that happens in this time period that you would be reading this book for. So the Dance of the Dragons, obviously, if you've read the books, if you've read the main books, if you've seen the TV show, that event gets mentioned a lot. It is the main reason why the Targaryens end up losing power 200 years later, or 150 years later, and it's also one of the main reasons why the dragons die out. I don't think that's a spoiler. If you've read Game of Thrones, you know that. So, yeah, it's definitely the biggest selling point of this book, and it's also the section that they're adapting for House of the Dragon, obviously. So that's definitely that's the section that carries the most interest. And personally, I like the Jaehaerys part more, but I really like the Dance of the Dragons part as well. And I actually think, again, the characters in the Dance of the Dragons are realized quite well in that historical lens. I do think that all of those characters aren't the most complex because obviously, again, we're not in their heads. We only see the things they're doing and the decisions they're making. And since it's a civil war, both sides are making very, very questionable decisions. So it's a very interesting conflict to read about, especially in this setting. It's like, okay, where are the good people here? So it feels like both sides, neither one has good people. But I would say that this section is very interesting because it shows you those aspects, and it shows you this is the main section that's written from 3 different sources. So all we get from about these people is kind of up for debate if these people were actually as terrible as they're portrayed in this book. So it's very interesting to read, and it's very interesting to think about, okay, which one of these three different accounts of each event is actually true, or the truth is most likely in between one of those, right? So, and the most interesting part is all three of our sources are biased. So it creates a very interesting dynamic where you're like reading about one event, but you get three different versions, and the actual truth might be in between. So I think Martin utilizes that narrative device he set up very well, but as I mentioned before, because this is a large civil war, this is the part where we get a lot of characters. We get a lot of armies, we get a lot of different, yeah, it's a civil war, so basically almost all the kingdoms start getting involved. And while I think that Martin tried to make all of them interesting, it's kind of, some of them get lost in the shuffle. Like there's a lot of people in there, and I couldn't tell you all the armies and all the houses that were part of which army. Like I know generally how the two parties align, but it's kind of hard to keep track of everything. And actually, I also talked with this about Jake in our spoiler discussion. I think both of us kind of agreed that we think that this Dance of the Dragons section would probably be the one that would benefit the most from being told as a novel. So basically, if anything out of this book would be taken out of it and be like, okay, let's retell this in a more standard novel-like structure, we both agreed it would be the Dance of the Dragons that would benefit the most. And that's basically because it is that kind of conflict where you would want to be in each of these characters' heads. Like if that was written like A Song of Ice and Fire, it might be as good. Like it has all those plot elements, it has all those character elements, it has the twists and turns. So it really feels like that's the section that would benefit the most out of being told in a different way. And thankfully, we get that now with the TV show. We will see it in a more different way. And in the TV show, they're probably not going to use the same framing device of having three different versions of each event. So we'll see maybe a more accurate representation of these characters and of these events. While I wouldn't say the Dance of Dragons was my favorite section of this book, I liked it way more than the first two sections. I liked it a bit less than the jihadist section. So this would be my second favorite section. And then after the Dance of the Dragons, we move into basically the outcome of the Civil War, which is basically, I'm just calling it after the dance. And basically we get the outcome and we see, okay, how does the political landscape align after this war ends? And that section it's interesting, but it's also kind of a bit weird to read because you had this big war that feels like, okay, it finishes, it feels like we've reached a climax, but then it keeps going for a few more pages, a few more chapters. And I think the part after it was also good, but it wasn't as good as either the Jahari section or the Dance of the Dragon section. I think it has some nice events that happened that I am glad were covered, but it kind of feels like the book could have ended after the dance, and then we could have picked it up at that. We could have put this last section into volume 2, because if you don't know, there is going to be a volume 2 if Martin ever gets to write it, which basically covers the second half of the Targaryen reign in Westeros. So yeah, basically the after the dance section, I enjoyed it. I think there are some very emotional parts in it, but it doesn't quite reach the levels of the dance and the Jaehaerys part. Um, yeah, so that's kind of my thoughts on those sections. Overall, I would say it's a very I would recommend reading it to fans of A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones. If you're interested in the lore, if you're interested in the history of the Targaryens, I think you will enjoy the book. Just go into it knowing that it's not a novel. It's written like a history book. And maybe think about this, what I talked about these different sources and what their biases are. I think that's a very interesting way to read this book. Um, yeah, so in terms of rating, the way I rated this, because it's kind of hard to rate as one book, and especially compared to novels, I kind of gave it three different ratings. Based on each third. So basically, I have a separate rating for the Dance of the Dragons, I have a separate rating for the Jaehaerys part, and I have a separate rating for the other three sections. And for the jihadist part, I would give that a 9.5 out of 10 because I think it makes use of this particular narrative style in an amazing way. It's written super well. I got super attached to these characters. Yeah, I can't see how a fake history book written as if it's written in a different universe would be done much better. So that's why I would give it a 9.5 out of 10. The Dance of the Dragons, I would give 9 out of 10. I think it's written very well. I think it would benefit from a different narrative style. So that's why, while I think the story itself and the events are super interesting to read about, I don't think it's the best story for this kind of narrative. And then the other three sections, so Aegon's Conquest, the Sons of the Dragon, and then the After the Dance section, those I would give like 8 out of 10. I was kind of going back and forth between 7.5 and 8, but I settled on 8 actually because I think I enjoyed it more than I realized. Like it felt a bit more, I felt more lukewarm because I liked the dance and the jihadist part so much, but after that I reflected a bit and I was like, the Aegon part was super interesting. The Sons of the Dragon part was also super interesting, and especially the Sons of the Dragon part leading into Jaehaerys' ascension was super interesting. And then the After the Dance part also has some really emotional moments. So I think 7.5 would be a bit harsh. So I would give it that part an 8 out of 10. So yeah, you can see I obviously really like the book, but if you average those out, you get 8.8. So that's kind of my rating for it. So overall a 4-star, not quite a 5-star book, but yeah, I enjoyed it more than I was expecting. Like I was very afraid that I wouldn't like this book because I was like, it's written like a history book. I'm not sure if it's going to be interesting to read, but I should have trusted my friend Scott on the Bald Booktuber, who has been telling me it's a great book and who has been saying like you would love it, and I was doubting it, and he was like, why were you doubting me? I shouldn't have doubted you, Scott. So yeah, if you're a fan of A Song of Ice and Fire, definitely read this book. And yeah, if you're planning to watch House of the Dragon and want to know all the plot twists and then see people's reactions to them, also you should read this book. If you're not a Song of Ice and Fire fan and you're not super invested in this particular part of the history of the world, I would say I wouldn't suggest you start your A Song of Ice and Fire journey here. If you've read A Song of Ice and Fire and you're just not super into the history, I would say give it a shot if you don't like the writing style. If you don't like the narrative style of the book, it's fine. You can stop reading it, but I think it's worth giving a shot. So yeah, I think it's worth a read. Yeah, obviously I don't love it as much as I love the main 5 books, but it was super solid. It has some very emotional sections, and I think it does feel like a book in A Song of Ice and Fire. It is George Martin, it is written very well, so yeah, that's my thoughts on that. I hope you enjoyed it. Please let me know if you've read Fire and Blood, how you feel. And yeah, as I mentioned before, please check out the spoiler discussion I did with Jake, where we went into some of these topics in more depth. We also talked about a little bit about the adaptation potential for House of the Dragon. And yeah, so I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.